Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata is one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written. You know it, or at least you think you do. But imagine you had never heard it and instead read the following description. A melancholic, meditative piano composition that evokes tragedy, depth of feeling, and quiet calm at the same time, built around a continuous flow of triplets and an expressive melodic line. Would this description give you any real understanding of what the Moonlight Sonata actually is? Of course not. You could analyze the structure, the tempo, the emotional intent, and still completely miss the thing itself. Keep that in mind. It will matter later. Now look around you. What do you see? A phone or laptop screen, furniture, the walls of a room, or quite possibly a bathroom, or maybe a crowded subway car rushing somewhere important. It's a simple question, and the answer feels obvious. What is much harder to answer is this: who sees it? You might say, that's easy, I see it. Really? And who are you? You have a name, you have a body, you have your experience and your perception of reality. But who are you? Who is the subject that perceives itself as you? Please don't think that by the end of this video, you will have a better understanding of what consciousness is. Humanity has been struggling with this problem for 1,000 years, and then MindWorld comes along and explains everything. That's ridiculous. As Australian philosopher and consciousness researcher David Chalmers writes in his book, The Conscious Mind, in putting forward these disparate ideas, I am not seeking to create a model that can withstand rigorous philosophical scrutiny. No, I simply want us to have some ideas at our disposal. We must begin to think about fundamental theories of consciousness. That disclaimer matters, and we'll take it seriously, not as a weakness, but as an honest starting point. At the same time, it's worth remembering one simple thing. David Chalmers is one thing, and you are another. His task is to build conceptual tools. Yours is far more unsettling, to notice what is using those tools right now. First, we need to be clear about what we are actually talking about, because the word consciousness is used to mean very different things. We can speak of consciousness simply as experience itself. The fact that when I see the world around me, I experience it, I am aware of it. In this sense, consciousness is not unique to humans. Animals also perceive, feel, and react. We can go further and include self-awareness, the ability to realize not only that an experience is happening, but that I am the one having it. With animals, this becomes more controversial. Some researchers believe certain species possess rudimentary self-awareness. Others disagree. But one fact feels intuitively undeniable. Human consciousness stands apart. It is not just stronger or faster, but qualitatively different from anything we observe in other species. Abstract thinking, language, symbolic communication, awareness of time and death, free will, the ability to reflect on our own thoughts. These traits form a gap so large that it forces us to ask whether something fundamentally unique exists in human nature. From here, two main positions emerge. The first argues that there is no true uniqueness. Human consciousness is simply the result of gradual evolutionary development taken to an extreme. The second claims the opposite, that there is something in humans that grants a set of qualities not reducible to biology alone, something absent in all other creatures. But regardless of which view one adopts, the core question remains unchanged. What is this? Something that experiences the world, knows that it is experiencing, and recognizes itself as the subject of that experience. Put simply, what is the I? And it is precisely this understanding of consciousness that will guide everything that follows. Not consciousness as raw sensation, not perception as such, but that which knows itself as the one who perceives. The self-aware subject, the inner I. David Chalmers writes, "We have good reason to believe that consciousness is generated by physical systems such as the brain, but we don't understand how this happens or why it exists at all. How could a physical system such as the brain also be a subject of experience? Why should something in it show what it is like to be such a system? Contemporary scientific theories hardly touch on the really difficult questions about consciousness. It's not that we don't have a detailed theory. We have absolutely no idea how consciousness is built into nature. Brian Greene describes the problem as follows. We have yet to formulate a rigorous scientific explanation of the phenomenon and experience of consciousness. We do not have a comprehensive description of how consciousness manifests the inner world of images, sounds, and sensations. His words are not without optimism. The very idea that we have yet to formulate a theory of consciousness implies a quiet confidence that, sooner or later, we will succeed, but I am far less certain. In fact, I suspect that defining the human eye may be impossible in principle. Anything that is defined must stand outside the thing doing the defining. It must be ontologically separate. But the eye is inseparable from the act of defining itself. You cannot step outside of yourself in order to describe yourself as an object. I cannot yet fully formalize this argument, but intuitively, it feels unavoidable. Imagine that you are not a human being in the usual physical sense. Your eye exists inside a simple physical shell, say, a small sphere. You can see, hear, and move through space. But there are no mirrors in this world, and no reflective surfaces. You can never see yourself from the outside. How would you describe yourself? Would you say, I am something that sees, hears, and moves? Perhaps. But in truth, we differ from this imagined sphere only in one respect. We inhabit a far more complex body, one that we can observe directly, even without a mirror. Because of this, we instinctively identify the I with the body. It feels obvious to us. But the self inside the body is no more identical to the body than the self inside the sphere is identical to the sphere. And yet, if we think about it carefully, the answer to the question, what is I, is already known to every one of us. It is deceptively simple. I am me. This is the only answer that does not miss the point. Your existence, the bare fact that you are aware of being, is itself the answer. From this perspective, all attempts to answer the question, what is I, are not really searches for new knowledge. They are attempts to translate something immediately obvious into language. Attempts to put into words what is already perfectly clear without words. The answer is not hidden. It is simply impossible to say anything more precise than what is already self-evident. Let us return to the Moonlight Sonata. It is simply impossible to convey it in words. Of course, one can describe it, but such a description will give the reader no real understanding of the piece itself. To understand it, one must hear it. And this feels completely natural, because music cannot be translated into language without losing its essence. Music belongs to a different domain, and this is where a parallel with consciousness becomes unavoidable. Perhaps the problem of consciousness is not that we do not understand it, but that we are trying to express it in the wrong medium. I have a suspicion, or rather, an intuition, that consciousness cannot be given a proper verbal formulation for the same reason the Moonlight Sonata cannot. Its nature is different. It cannot be captured by words. It can only be known directly, through experience, through being aware of oneself. After all, what is language? Words are a way of materializing abstractions. Consider the immaterial world of ideas. Abstract concepts that exist within it do not always have a direct material embodiment. We can easily represent a square or a circle, even if imperfectly, but emotions such as sadness, joy, hatred, or anger have no visible form. We only observe their manifestations. The same applies to qualities like salty, red, or loud. We can describe them verbally, but only approximately. Without personal experience, words alone cannot convey what they truly are. This leads to an important conclusion. Language allows us to describe immaterial categories that lack direct physical embodiment, but only with limited precision. These categories can be fully known only empirically by each individual through direct experience. And if this is the case, then it seems reasonable to assume that the I, the very core that constitutes a person, cannot be captured in a verbal definition at all. For the same reason, it may belong to a category that is ontologically independent of the material world. Ego, self, Atman, Ruh, Nafs. These are all attempts to name that which perceives its own existence, that which we call the human I. They are words, labels. The essence itself remains undefined and perhaps cannot yet be defined at all. So what do we actually have today? From the standpoint of modern science, taken in a broad sense, four main approaches to consciousness are usually distinguished: Physicalism, often called materialism, emergentism, dualism, and idealism. Physicalism explains consciousness by reducing it to derivatives of complex material processes in the brain. From this perspective, consciousness is nothing more than a byproduct of highly organized matter, a kind of epiphenomenon generated by neural activity. This view is currently one of the most popular in mainstream science. Emergentism, in our view, can be seen as an upgraded version of physicalism. It also traces the origin of consciousness to the brain, but treats it as an emergent phenomenon, something that arises when a system reaches a certain level of complexity. Emergentism does not necessarily insist on a one-to-one correspondence between mental states and physiological processes, which is typical of strict physicalism, but it still places consciousness firmly within the material framework. Dualism is a much broader and more flexible position. In general, it rests on the idea that consciousness and the body are fundamentally different in nature. Some dualist views regard consciousness as a fully independent entity, while others still tie it to the body, denying it autonomous existence. Yet even in these softer versions, consciousness is acknowledged as something qualitatively distinct from matter. And finally, idealism. This is the most radical approach. It claims that nothing exists except consciousness itself, that matter, space, and even time are secondary or derivative phenomena, arising within consciousness rather than existing independently of it. What is interesting is that just as science lacks a single, universally accepted concept of consciousness, religion does as well. Moreover, even within a single religious tradition, we often find very different interpretations of what consciousness, soul, or self actually are. In Christianity, for example, there are the notions of soul and spirit, yet different theologians describe their nature and relationship in subtly different ways. In Islam, we encounter nafs and ruh, which roughly correspond to the concepts of soul and spirit, though not without important distinctions. In Judaism, especially in its early forms, there were movements that denied the existence of an immortal soul altogether. At the same time, classical Judaism, as an Abrahamic tradition, generally affirms the presence of an enduring essence within the human being. Buddhism takes a radically different route, denying the existence of an eternal, non-material soul as a separate entity, and instead focusing on a detailed analysis of mental processes and layers of experience. Hinduism, by contrast, affirms the existence of jiva, an eternal, non-material essence that migrates from body to body through reincarnation. At this point, someone might object. Here he goes again, bringing religion into the discussion. Judging by some reactions, there seems to be a group of people who feel an almost instinctive aversion to any mention of religion. This is unfortunate, and it requires a brief clarification. This is the number of people currently living on Earth. They are vastly different, rich and poor, young and old, belonging to different nations, races, and cultures. And among all these people, according to various estimates, no more than 15% identify as atheists. Some studies suggest the number may be as low as 2%. Think about that for a moment. At least 85% of humanity believes in God, gods, or some form of transcendent reality. There is also a common argument that atheism itself functions as a belief system, no less than any religious worldview. So the question arises, is it really reasonable to dismiss this overwhelming majority of humanity as backward, naive, or uneducated? Doing so would require us to label figures such as Tolstoy, Pasteur, Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, and even Einstein as ignorant or misguided. All of them, in one way or another, held religious or spiritual views, however surprising that may seem to some. And the Big Bang Theory, so often invoked by strict materialists, was formulated by a Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. Whether we like it or not, religion has existed for as long as humanity itself, and the contribution of people with a religious worldview to the formation of modern civilization is not merely undeniable, it is enormous. Philosophy, Art, ethics, science, and even the foundations of modern law were shaped in cultures deeply infused with religious thought. What is especially striking is that even today, after centuries of unprecedented material progress and equally unprecedented secularization, the religious view of reality remains relevant for the vast majority of people on the planet. It has not vanished. It has not been replaced. It has adapted. From this perspective, it seems at the very least unreasonable to reject all this accumulated experience spanning thousands of years simply because someone considers it obsolete. For this reason, we will continue to turn to religious experience when it is appropriate, not as dogma, but as one of humanity's most persistent and influential ways of grappling with the deepest questions of existence. So, the main question remains unclear. What exactly perceives the experience of emotions and realizes itself? Is consciousness generated by complex processes in the brain, or is it an ontologically separate entity? But who is the subject experiencing this experience? Science remains perplexed on this issue, and it's no wonder. Here is what Brian Greene writes. To fully appreciate the depth of the mystery, imagine that you have a superhuman ability to look into my brain and see each of its trillions of particles, electrons, protons, and neutrons. See how they collide with each other, attract and repel each other, float and rush about. Unlike the large sets of drifting particles in baked bread or particles gathering to form a star, the particles that make up the brain are united in a highly organized, orderly structure. Nevertheless, focus on any one of the particles, and you will find that it interacts with the rest through exactly the same forces, described by exactly the same mathematics. And it doesn't matter whether that particle is floating around your kitchen, around the crown of the North Star, or around my prefrontal cortex. And within this mathematical description, confirmed by decades of data from particle accelerators and powerful telescopes, there is nothing that even hints at the inner experiences that these particles somehow generate. How can a set of mindless, thoughtless, emotionless particles come together and produce an internal sensation of color and sound, delight or awe, confusion or surprise? Particles may have mass, electric charge, and a few other similar characteristics, but all these qualities seem completely unrelated to anything even remotely resembling subjective experiences. How, then, does the whirlwind of particles inside the head and the brain is nothing more than a whirlwind of particles give rise to impressions, sensations, and feelings? Indeed, how could that be? Or perhaps consciousness doesn't arise from the brain at all. Perhaps impressions, sensations, and emotions are experienced by something else entirely, something that cannot be detected with a microscope, simply because it is not made of matter. Impossible, right? Immaterial consciousness? Seriously? That doesn't sound scientific at all. You might as well start talking about the soul. Everything, we are told, must have a strict, rational, material explanation. And yet, in their relentless attempt to force consciousness into this framework, scientists sometimes find themselves in rather curious positions, proposing explanations that are no less strange and sometimes far more convoluted than the very ideas they are trying so hard to avoid. For example, Max Tegmark offers his own unique explanation for this problem. Here is a rather long quote from him, but it is extremely interesting. Your model of reality includes a model of yourself. That is why you not only perceive, but also have self-awareness. When you feel that you are looking at a book, what is actually happening is this. The model of reality in your brain contains a model of you looking at the model of this book. This leads to a question that is fundamental to the problem of consciousness. Who is looking at your brain's model of reality to generate subjective awareness? My guess is no one. If there were another part of your brain that actually looked at the model of reality as a whole and was aware of all this information, then that area of the brain would have to physically move that information into its own local copy. From an evolutionary point of view, this would be a waste of resources, and neurophysiological research finds no evidence of such large-scale duplication. Moreover, this still would not answer the question. If an observer is indeed necessary, then the duplicated model of reality would in turn need an observer to be subjectively perceived. And this would lead to yet another problem of infinite regression. On the contrary, I believe that my answer is beautiful in its simplicity. No observer is required, because your consciousness is, in essence, your model of reality. I think consciousness is the way information feels that it is being processed by certain complex methods. Since different parts of the brain interact with each other, different parts of your model of reality can also interact, so that your model of yourself can interact with your model of the outside world, giving rise to the subjective feeling that the former perceives the latter. When you look at a strawberry, your model of the color red feels subjectively very real, and the same thing happens with your model of your mental gaze from a certain observational position. The brain is remarkably inventive in interpreting basic types of electrical signals in bundles of neurons as qualia, which are subjectively experienced as different. We perceive them as colors, sounds, smells, tastes, or touches, depending on whether the bundle of neurons comes from the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, or skin. The key difference is not in the neurons that transmit information, but in the patterns of their connections. Although your perception of yourself and your perception of strawberries are different, it is plausible to assume that at a fundamental level, both are of the same type complex patterns in space-time. In other words, I argue that your perception of yourself, that is, the observation platform you call I, is a qualia, just like the subjective perception of red or green. This example clearly shows where the reductionist approach ultimately leads. Tegmark confines consciousness strictly to the physical substance of the brain and immediately falls into a conceptual trap. Which part of the brain, then, is the observer? And even if we somehow identified it, who would be observing that part? And who would observe the observer? This leads to an infinite regress. Neurophysiological research finds nothing resembling such an inner observer. From an evolutionary standpoint, which is oddly treated as an unquestionable axiom, this would also represent a completely pointless expenditure of resources, a dead end. And yet, the conscious I undeniably exists. Each of us can verify this directly. Faced with this contradiction, Tegmark proposes what he considers a truly elegant solution. When asked who actually perceives and realizes this internal model of reality, he answers simply and scientifically, no one. Information realizes itself. Moreover, he seems genuinely pleased by the elegance of this answer. In other words, if you believe you are a personality endowed with consciousness, freedom, and inner experience, then no. You are merely an illusion, no more real than a red tomato or a pickled cucumber. The brain collects data from the external world through receptors, processes it, and outputs a finished perception. This is a cucumber, this is a tomato, and this is you. In reality, there is no redness, no saltiness, only physical parameters. And what you take to be a real, thinking, experiencing self is merely a simulation, a convenient fiction, a bundle of qualia, a model. But wait, how can something be aware of itself at all? Why, then? Isn't a tomato self-aware, or is it? This quickly slides into absurdity. When we say that water is cold or wet, we mean that we experience it that way. Coldness and wetness are not properties of water itself, but features of our perception and highly relative ones at that. Water has a certain temperature, which we may interpret as cold, and it exists in a liquid state, which we interpret as wet. And yet here we are being asked to accept the idea that water somehow defines itself as cold and wet. That information somehow experiences itself. At this point, the explanation begins to resemble the very mysticism it was meant to replace. Let's take another example. A movie stored on a digital medium is nothing more than a sequence of zeros and ones. By itself, this sequence is not a movie. It merely has the potential to become one. For that potential to be realized, a third-party system is required, a playback device capable of reading the code, decoding it, and translating it into electrical commands for transistors. And even that is not enough. A viewer is also required, someone who perceives the resulting patterns of light and sound as a story, characters, emotions, meaning. And yet here, we are being asked to believe that a sequence of zeros and ones can somehow do all of this on its own. That the code watches itself as a movie, admires the plot, empathizes with the protagonist, or even experiences the events from the protagonist's point of view. In other words, that information is both the film, the projector, and the audience at the same time. But this is almost exactly what is being proposed in the case of the human brain. Neurons transmit electrical impulses that encode information coming from sensory receptors. Tegmark suggests that these neurons, or perhaps the elementary particles they consist of, or even the abstract informational patterns flowing through them, somehow perceive the reality they encode. Not only that, they allegedly perceive themselves as perceiving it. One might object that the information stored on a hard drive is nowhere near as complex as the information processed by the brain, and therefore does not experience itself as a movie. The same could be said about a red tomato. It lacks sufficient informational complexity to be self-aware. But at some higher level of complexity, we are told, information suddenly begins to experience itself as a personality. The problem is that we have no idea where this threshold lies or whether such a threshold exists at all. How complex must information be before it begins to feel like something from the inside? At what point does encoding become experience? No answer is given. Complexity is simply invoked as a kind of magic word. And without a clear mechanism, the claim that information realizes itself explains nothing. It merely replaces one mystery with another, dressed in more technical language. The materialist approach claims that consciousness is generated by the complexity of the brain. But the human brain is far from the largest among mammals, either in weight or in volume. Humans are not even the leaders in the number of neurons in the cerebral cortex or in the brain as a whole. It is often argued that intelligence, though not identical to consciousness, correlates not with absolute brain size, but with the ratio of brain mass to body mass. Perhaps this holds statistically, but it is a fragile argument at best. If we treat the brain as a kind of computational system that produces consciousness once a certain level of complexity is reached, then why should the mass of the body matter at all? If a system is sufficiently large and sufficiently complex, consciousness should emerge regardless of what it is attached to. Yet this is not what we observe. Take the bottlenose dolphin. Its brain weighs roughly twice as much as a human brain and contains about 2.5 times more neurons in its cortex. We can set aside the emotionally charged question of whether dolphins possess consciousness or personality, although with such hardware it would be strange if they didn't. But even if they do, how would we ever know? They swim, eat fish, reproduce, and live entirely within their ecological niche. They do not invent wheels, write symphonies, or split the atom. But why should they? How do we even define personality in a being that never violates our expectations of what it is supposed to do? There is another problem for physicalism that is even more unsettling. The human body is in a constant state of renewal at the molecular and atomic level. This process is uneven. Different tissues renew at different rates, but it is generally accepted that within about a year, up to 98% of the atoms in your body have been replaced. The person you see in a photograph taken a year ago only looks like you. At the level of elementary particles, it was literally a different physical system. And yet, your personality has not reset. You did not lose your memories, your skills, or your sense of self. Your inner I feels exactly the same. You are still you. From a strictly materialist perspective, this is deeply puzzling. If consciousness is nothing more than a property of a particular configuration of matter, then why does replacing almost all of that matter not result in a new subject of experience? What exactly persists through this total physical turnover? These questions do not refute physicalism outright, but they expose its weak points. They suggest that whatever consciousness is, it does not map neatly onto brain mass, neuron count, or even the specific atoms that happen to make up your body at any given moment. Let's read Chalmers. Explaining consciousness is not the same as explaining structure and function. After explaining the entire physical structure associated with the brain and explaining the mechanisms by which various brain functions are carried out, we still need to explain consciousness itself. Why should all this structure and function give rise to experience? A description of physical processes does not answer this question. In all fairness, we can only state two facts. Self-aware personality among all living organisms seems to be inherent only in humans, and humans have a highly organized brain. Although sometimes there are doubts that this is true for everyone. Just kidding. But can we draw an unambiguous conclusion on this basis that it is precisely this brain that is the source of this personality, that it generates it? In fact, this conclusion is so dubious that it is difficult to ignore. And even in the scientific community, there are many people who understand that a materialistic approach to consciousness is futile. Chalmers writes, "By temperament, I am very much inclined toward a materialistic, reductive explanation, and I have no strong spiritualistic or religious inclinations. For many years, I held out hope for a materialistic theory, and I only reluctantly abandoned it. In the end, it became clear to me that these conclusions cannot be avoided by anyone who wants to take consciousness seriously. Materialism is a beautiful and exciting picture of the world. But to explain consciousness, we must use additional resources." Roger Penrose writes, "With our current level of knowledge about the fundamental structure of physical reality, we have very little chance of achieving any deep understanding of the nature of the mind. I am convinced that our understanding of the physical world around us has long been in need of radical revolutionary change. Until such changes come about, any claim of real progress in understanding the true nature of thought processes seems to me to be a manifestation of unbridled optimism." The famous Christian apologist and martyr of the 2nd century, Justin the philosopher, said the following, "Man was created for communion with the Logos. Outside of the Logos, he does not know who he is or why he exists." You might say that those were dark ages, empty fables, a time before scientific thinking. Yes, these words were spoken almost 19 centuries ago. But isn't it ironic that even today humanity still does not truly know who it is or why it exists? Isn't that strange? It is difficult to overstate how far modern scientific thought has advanced since those distant times. We have penetrated deep into the structure of the brain, down to neurons, synapses, and even elementary particles. And yet, when it comes to consciousness, it feels as though we are still wandering through shadows, grasping for meaning, with no solid ground and no certainty in sight. The dualistic approach to consciousness claims that consciousness itself is not material, even though it is closely connected to the physical body. From this perspective, a highly developed brain is required not to generate consciousness, but to express or realize it within the physical world. And this idea goes far beyond classical Cartesian dualism. Dualism is, in fact, a very broad framework. Take a computer as an analogy. For it to function properly, it must have a microprocessor. Without it, nothing meaningful will happen, even if the monitor is plugged into the power outlet. But the processor itself does not create the content or the meaning of what appears on the screen. It merely processes information that comes from elsewhere, from memory, storage, or external input. The source of that information is ontologically different from the processor that handles it. In the same way, dualism suggests that the brain may be a necessary interface, a biological processor, but not the origin of consciousness itself. David Chalmers adheres to a dualistic concept, which he openly admits. "For a long time, I resisted the dualism of mind and body, but now I approve of it, not only as the only position that can be defended, but also as satisfactory in itself. It cannot be ruled out that I am confused somewhere or have overlooked a new radical possibility, but I feel no discomfort in saying that dualism is most likely correct." His dualism seems to consist in the idea that consciousness does not arise directly from matter, but is some other realization of information. It is connected to the physical, but not because the physical generates consciousness, but because both have information as their source. However, he considers information itself, referring to the work of Gregory Bateson in this definition. Information is difference, making a difference. This does little to clarify what information itself actually is. And even within this dualistic framework, Chalmers does not treat consciousness as a fully independent entity. In this sense, he turns out to be closer to Tegmark than it might seem, sharing the idea that information, under certain conditions, manifests as phenomenal experience. If a system, a carrier of information, reaches sufficient complexity, it begins to generate sensations and, at some point, the experience of self-awareness. In his book, Chalmers even considers an ordinary thermostat as an information processing system, an idea that did not originate with him but with John McCarthy. The informational content there is minimal, only 3 states: heating, cooling, and inactivity. Yet it is still information nonetheless. And Chalmers argues, those who consider the assumption that a thermostat could have experiences to be absurd should at least explain why this assumption is absurd. The case must be that the thermostat lacks some property that is obviously required for the existence of experiential experiences. But, in my opinion, we do not find such obvious properties. Perhaps some key ingredient is involved in information processing that is absent in a thermostat and present in a mouse, or absent in a mouse but present in humans. But I do not see such an ingredient that would obviously be required for experience. And in fact, it is not obvious that such an ingredient should exist at all. Of course, to say that thermostats have experience is not to say that they have a real semblance of mental life. A thermostat will not have self-awareness. It will not have even the slightest signs of intelligence. And then a natural question arises. If the idea that a thermostat might have some form of experience does not strike us as outright absurd, why does self-awareness suddenly become a problem? Yes, such experience would clearly not resemble ours, but so what? Whoever said that consciousness must be complex, rich, or human-like by default? For Chalmers, as for Tegmark, information itself becomes the source of experience and therefore of consciousness. Yet, this is precisely where the difficulty lies. We still do not understand what information actually is. We have no clear answer to how, why, or under what conditions information gives rise to experience, let alone to the awareness of itself as a subject. And whatever information may be in its essence, it seems unavoidable that it must originate from somewhere. Or does it? Idealism goes even further. It claims that matter does not exist at all, and that only consciousness exists, experiencing itself, including what we call matter. Of course, this is not a complete or unified theory either. Every idealist builds their own system, and Kant, Hegel, and Berkeley disagree on many fundamental points. Still, the idea itself is difficult to dismiss outright. The first problem that immediately arises is obvious. Such a worldview only makes sense if there is some form of higher or universal consciousness that encompasses everything. Both Kant and Hegel understood this perfectly well. Without such a superconsciousness, idealism collapses into radical solipsism. Only my consciousness exists, and everything I perceive, including you, is merely an illusion. And you, in turn, would say exactly the same about me. At that point, we are no longer dealing with explanations, only with mutually incompatible assertions. Berkeley himself understood this. Whatever power I may have over my own thoughts, I find that the ideas actually perceived in sensation are not dependent on my will. When I open my eyes in full daylight, it is not my will that determines whether I see or do not see, nor does it determine which objects will appear before my eyes. The same applies to hearing and other senses. The ideas they capture are not creations of my will. There is, therefore, another will or another spirit that produces them. And here we arrive at the question of the relationship between consciousness and existence, a question that is far more important than it might seem at first glance. According to idealism, these two concepts are essentially identical. To exist is to be perceived, yet our everyday experience appears to contradict this idea. We see countless objects around us that seem completely devoid of consciousness, and it is extremely difficult for us to imagine that they do not truly exist. So what is existence? What is reality? And how can we define it at all? From this perspective, existence is determined either by the consciousness of the thing itself or by the presence of an external observer capable of confirming its existence through perception. I can be absolutely certain of my own existence because I experience it directly from within. In the same way, I can confidently assert the existence of other objects because I see them, touch them, or perceive them through my senses. These objects exist for me. And yet, an object that is completely inaccessible to my perception, one whose presence does not visibly affect anything I can perceive effectively, does not exist for me, even though it may be objectively affirmed for someone else who can perceive it at this very moment. From this, a clear conclusion follows. The existence of such an object is relative, not absolute. Even my own existence is absolute only for me, as its creator and observer, but not for someone who has never seen me and does not know that I exist. Consequently, even my own existence, despite my direct awareness of it, remains relative. This is true, however, only if we do not take into account the possibility of a higher, all-encompassing consciousness. If we introduce such a consciousness into our reasoning, then every object acquires an objective and absolute existence in relation to it, because nothing lies beyond its perception. This superconsciousness is aware of itself and therefore exists objectively in relation to itself. Just as you exist objectively in relation to yourself, it perceives and observes the entire universe, granting it objective existence in relation to its awareness, just as objects perceived by you acquire existence in relation to you. But if we remove this superconsciousness from the discussion, it becomes clear that the existence of everything else is merely relative and therefore open to doubt. And everyone already knows what this superconsciousness is called. It is God. If God exists, then everything exists. But if God does not exist, then the existence of everything else becomes purely subjective relative to the observer who brings it into being, and in that sense, illusory. From this, a stark conclusion follows. Not only does God exist, but only God exists objectively. This is the logic by which the existence of God is established. And if you reject this conclusion, there is only one position left to you: solipsism. You can only confidently assert your own existence. Incidentally, the most authoritative Christian theologian of the 4th century, Blessed Jerome of Stridon, writes explicitly, "There is only one nature of God that truly exists, for it has nothing that would support it from outside. But it is inherent in it to be. The rest, which is created, only seems to exist." If we accept this view, then information, whatever it may be, finds its source, and the theories of Chalmers, Tegmark, and others become quite workable. In general, based on this approach, many paradoxes disappear. The source of our reality turns out to be something we call information, which, in turn, stems from higher consciousness. This information is realized, on the one hand, in the physical, and on the other, in the phenomenal, giving rise to experience and consciousness. Our material reality turns out to be, on the one hand, illusory, as perceived by our senses, and on the other hand, quite objectively existing, as perceived by higher consciousness or God. Therefore, if I am not looking at the moon at the moment, it does not mean that it does not exist, and the dispute between Einstein and Bohr loses its meaning. God really does not play dice, as Einstein claimed. For him, everything is predetermined. But for our consciousness, reality is probabilistic. In general, the topic of consciousness in the context of the currently popular hypothesis of the quantum multiverse is extremely interesting and deserves a separate video. Whatever anyone says, there seems to be a connection between consciousness and the quantum level of the universe. As Brian Greene writes, the so-called quantum measurement problem is to understand the mysterious inequality between the fuzzy quantum reality described by equations and the familiar, distinct reality we are used to dealing with. Imagine that the rules of quantum mechanics apply throughout the entire chain, from the selected electron to the particles in the measuring equipment and the particles that make up the reading on the instrument panel. But when you look at the display and the sensor data from it flows into your brain, something changes. Standard quantum laws cease to apply. Instead, when it comes to conscious perception, some other process comes into play that ensures that you get a single definite result. Thus, consciousness becomes an active participant in quantum physics. It is consciousness that dictates that as the world develops, all possible future options, except for one, are eliminated either from reality altogether or from our version of reality. And Chalmers confirms, of all the proposed criteria for wave function collapse, the only one that has any chance is the one according to which measurement occurs when a quantum system affects the consciousness of some being. Unlike the previous criteria, it is at least definite and not arbitrary. But let us return to our main thread. What is striking is that once we introduce a higher, all-encompassing consciousness into the discussion, the apparent contradiction between idealism and dualism largely disappears. From the perspective of human consciousness, matter possesses objective existence, and the immaterial mind, or personality, is indeed bound to the physical body, remaining an ontologically distinct phenomenon with a different nature. Yet, from the standpoint of divine consciousness, matter is nothing more than a mental representation, a chimera. Just as a person can shape and control their own imagination, God can shape and control all matter, presenting reality to us, at least in part, as a fait accompli. As Berkeley himself wrote, another will, or another spirit that produces them. That is, ideas that we perceive as reality. I admit that I personally tend to believe that our personality, consciousness, and mind are, in fact, ontologically independent. I would even go further and suggest that the universe is built upon only two fundamental elements: consciousness and information. Everything that exists emerges from the interaction between these two. The material world is information realized in physical form, while the immaterial world is information perceived directly by consciousness itself. Of course, this is nothing more than an assumption, and I cannot offer any empirical proof for it. Let us try a thought experiment. Imagine yourself in a state in which you have never had any experience at all. You were never born, you never had a body, you never perceived matter, your brain. The moment it came into existence, somehow had all sensory input completely blocked. It is a disturbing scenario, I agree, but stay with it. What would you be in such a state? At first glance, it seems like you would be nothing at all, because without experience, you would not exist in any meaningful sense. You would have no concepts to operate with, no memories to recall, no sensations or feelings to grasp. Does this mean, then, that personality is nothing more than the sum of experience, essentially memory? And yet, if a person, God forbid, were to suffer complete memory loss, their personality would not vanish. Subjectively, their entire past would be erased, and they would believe that their existence began only moments ago, but they would still exist. They will lose their skills and knowledge, even about themselves, but their personality will not disappear. It is possible to reset a person's memory every day. There are also such pathologies, but this does not mean that their conscious I will appear anew every day. And from our own experience, we know that inside ourselves, we clearly separate our experience from ourselves. We can clearly see that there is someone inside us who uses the body to interact with the surrounding reality, who makes decisions, feels, suffers, thinks, who accumulates all this experience. But this someone is not the experience itself. It turns out that there is a certain essence capable of accumulating experience, like a blank sheet of paper on which we can write information. Apparently, this essence itself is neutral. It is neither good nor bad. It is neither kind nor evil, neither smart nor stupid. It is simple, separate from experience. It is existence as such, regardless of context and perception. Yes, without experience, it would remain only a kind of potential, a unit of being with no self-awareness. But the point is that it never remains in this state. Once it arises, it connects with a physical body and immediately begins to accumulate experience, and thus to become aware of its existence. In other words, without this essence, it is impossible to accumulate conscious experience, and without experience, this essence remains only a kind of existential potential. Have you ever experienced a lucid dream? It is an extraordinary phenomenon. Fortunately, I have had such an experience myself. Only once, and quite a long time ago, so the details have faded, but the impression has never left me. What happened in that dream felt absolutely real. It was indistinguishable from waking life. You can judge the level of realism by one simple fact. At some point, I genuinely asked myself how I could tell whether I was dreaming or actually awake. I will say that again because it matters. In the dream, I was wondering how to determine whether I was in a dream or in the real world. The dream lasted a long time. I believe somewhere between half an hour and an hour. I was walking down the street through a sunlit city square, unable to accept that this was a dream. Everything felt real, completely real. People were walking around me. I spoke to them, asked questions, and they answered. To preempt any sarcastic remarks, I should clarify that I went to bed sober, healthy, and without taking any substances. When I woke up, I was in shock for about 10 minutes. I had just returned from a completely different, yet entirely real world, one that was indistinguishable from this one, much like Neo after being disconnected from the Matrix. That experience made one thing painfully clear to me. What I now perceive as objective reality, despite its vivid material solidity, can under certain conditions turn out to be fiction, an illusion, a dream. Of course, altered states of consciousness can be explained, and under the influence of substances, such experiences may not seem particularly mysterious. None of this is new, but that is not the point. The point is that your I is the only thing whose existence is certain for you. Everything else you perceive is conditional and can change depending on circumstances. Here, it is fitting to recall the words of Gregory of Nazianzus. Everything temporary is like a dream, and everything eternal is like awakening. At first glance, this sounds like a beautiful metaphor. But what if it was meant literally, or almost literally? What if, after consciousness separates from its physical carrier, an entirely different reality opens before it? One in comparison to which physical life itself feels like a dream. And here we arrive at the next unsettling question. Can your consciousness disappear? Can it truly cease to exist? This is not an abstract or idle thought. Once, while walking through the city, going about my ordinary errands, I suddenly looked around and realized something simple and terrifying. Every single person I saw, 100% of them knows for certain that one day, to put it mildly, their life will end. They all know this. It is an undeniable fact. Here is the second fact. 100% of these people have no idea when exactly this will happen. Moreover, they all know that it could happen at any moment. And the third fact is the most astonishing of all. Despite knowing both of these things, almost none of them appear to feel any real anxiety about it. Isn't that strange? Even relatively trivial events, an exam, a job interview, or an interview at Google demand preparation and generate stress, tension, and discomfort. Yet, here we are talking about the end of one's own existence, and there is nothing, as if it will never happen. And that is when a thought occurred to me. Maybe this calm is not accidental. Maybe consciousness at some deeper level knows that it cannot disappear, and that is precisely why it remains so indifferent to its own end. Of course, this is not a claim. It is only an assumption. Let's suppose that a person's consciousness, their inner I, their personality, exists ontologically outside of matter and is only attached to the body, which means it is not subject to the laws of time, according to which everything that has a beginning also has an end. Matter, as perceived by consciousness, may well disappear or transform into another reality. But self-awareness exists objectively for itself, which means that its existence cannot cease. You can look at it from another angle. How is our existence realized? In essence, it is just a space between memory and prediction. The closer to the present moment, the clearer and brighter the memories, and the more accurate the prediction. Let's say you sit down at the table and are about to eat. You sat down just a second ago, and your body clearly remembers all the sensations, and you realize that you are sitting at the table. For you, this is conscious reality. You see the cutlery in front of you very clearly. You understand its location, and there is no reason to think that the table will tip over now. This makes it possible to predict the course of events based on which your body receives the command to pick up the fork with your hand. The clarity of the experience you have just had and your confidence in the immediate future shape the process of conscious existence. This continuous process of turning predictions into memories is your conscious existence. This is your life. As they say, it's the moment between the past and the future. But the process of awareness takes time. Even if it's only a fraction of a second, it takes some time for us to realize that we have sat down at the table. That is, objectively, we all live a little in the past, lagging behind reality by the time it takes to become aware. And if you are aware of yourself now, then you are guaranteed to exist in the future, even if only a few fractions of a second ahead. Thus, If your existence were to cease a few fractions of a second ahead, you would not be able to be aware of yourself now. This means that if somewhere in the future, even if it is very distant, your existence ceases, then the whole series of moments collapses, and you would not be able to be aware of your existence at any moment in time. This leads to a simple conclusion. If you are aware of your existence now, then it will never cease in the future. We can all sincerely congratulate ourselves on this. Some researchers believe that time does not exist at all. Each moment of time is simply a certain state of the universe. All these states objectively exist, always and everywhere. Our consciousness only jumps from the perception of one state to another, and we perceive this as the passage of time. Thus, all your accumulated experience exists objectively, and if it were to cease at some point, it would disappear altogether. And we come to the same conclusion. If you are aware of your existence, then it objectively exists and cannot cease in the future. Because there is no future, there is only existence as such. But if existence and its awareness cannot cease, then it is not material, because we know for sure that the material sooner or later ceases to exist. Well, let us assume that the human I, our consciousness, is indeed an immaterial entity, one that realizes its existence in the material world through the body, to which it is connected by means of a certain interface whose nature remains unclear to us. If this is the case, then an intriguing and unavoidable question immediately arises. Can you guess what it is? I'll even give you a couple of seconds to think about it. The question is this: is it possible to admit the existence of similar personal entities whose existence takes place entirely outside of matter? That is, personal consciousnesses that are not tied to a physical carrier. This is a serious question, one that probably deserves a separate discussion of its own. On the one hand, we have already established that the conscious I cannot become aware of its own existence without lived experience. It must absorb at least a minimal amount of experience in order to recognize itself and acquire the ability to think abstractly, to operate with concepts and categories that are learned empirically. If such a conscious I, a personal consciousness, is not bound to a material body, then it lacks experiential input altogether and therefore cannot realize itself as a personality. But on the other hand, it would be naive to assume that the ontological union of an immaterial personality with a physical body is the only possible way of acquiring experience. The connection to material reality may take different forms, perhaps less direct, less rigid. Moreover, experience itself may be acquired within immaterial reality. For now, let us leave this question open. As mystics often say, material gross substance is simply too bright for us consciousness embodied in flesh to perceive non-material reality. They speak of subtle worlds, of a spiritual realm. The night sky is extraordinarily rich and beautiful, but if you stand in a city flooded with the light of street lamps and advertising signs, you will barely see it. Only the brightest stars will pierce through the glare. Yet, if you find yourself far from civilization, in complete darkness, the full majesty of the starry sky reveals itself. The same is true here. Material reality, along with our five senses that bind consciousness to the physical world, is overwhelmingly bright. It produces intense emotions and constant reactions that drown out everything else. As a result, the immaterial, spiritual life of consciousness often goes entirely unnoticed. To perceive it, we must partially shield ourselves from the harsh intensity of the material world. Many religious traditions have developed specific practices for precisely this purpose, and strikingly, they are often very similar. Solitude, reduced social interaction, fasting, otkaz from entertainment and sensory overload. Do you really think all of this is just a kind of quasi-religious, parapsychological fantasy? Not at all. The famous German philosopher Karl Rosenkreuz, one of Hegel's most talented students, conveys the following idea of Kant. It can be considered almost proven, or could easily be proven, that the human soul in this life is inextricably linked to all immaterial beings of the spiritual world. That it alternately acts in one world and then the other, and receives impressions from these beings, which it, as an earthly human being, is not aware of as long as everything is going well. That is, as long as it enjoys the material world. Let's dig even deeper. Here are the words of the ancient philosopher Plotinus. Not all of our soul dwells permanently in the sensual body, but only a certain part of it, which, being immersed in this world and therefore becoming denser, or rather, cluttered and clouded, prevents us from perceiving what the higher part of our soul perceives. Souls are like amphibians. They live either on this side or in the other world, depending on necessity. As you can see, it is not religion alone that affirms the existence of an immaterial personality in human beings. Until relatively recently, this was considered almost self-evident by both philosophers and scientists alike. Only with the rise of crude materialism in academic circles was this idea gradually marginalized and pushed out of serious scientific discussion. One might argue that in strictly scientific discourse, concepts such as consciousness, personality, mind, or soul simply have no place after all. Physics deals with experiments and objective verification. But has our overall understanding of reality truly benefited from this exclusion? Hardly. The absurdities we have already encountered, such as the idea of information being self-aware, make this especially clear. Paradoxically, these attempts end up reviving the very notion they tried to eliminate: consciousness as an immaterial phenomenon. Once we acknowledge this, alongside the physical body that constitutes human nature, we gain a new lens through which to reconsider some of the most advanced theories of modern physics, including the simulation hypothesis and the quantum multiverse. But more on that another time. You are probably already tired, and this topic clearly demands further, deeper reflection. Thank you for staying with me to the end and listening to this entire stream of thought. Just remember one thing. In reality, everything is far more complicated.